Good evening. I'm Eric Zawadzki. I'm the developer for the Deviant the Renegades role-playing game, and I've been running a game called Chronicle called Cautionary Tale for more than a year now. However, due to some technology hiccups, a couple episodes got deleted, episodes 9 and 10. And while I initially thought, oh yeah, it probably wasn't anything super important, looking at my notes, yeah, there's some stuff you missed. So I'm just going to provide a hopefully pretty quick summary of what was in those two episodes so that episodes 11 through wherever we get to by the end make a little bit more sense. Episode 9 was titled Stick Your Dominant Hand in It, which is actually kind of an inside joke in my group with regarding horror movies and behavior in there. Wherein characters in horror movies, when presented with a mysterious hole anywhere or mysterious substance, decide to stick their dominant hand in it, therefore risking really inviting a horrible, life-altering injury, which I'm sure is quite intentional by the filmmakers to make us sort of wince a little bit, like, what are you doing? And you see it a lot in Stranger Things, especially that first season where all these yonic portals keep on opening and everyone in the media is like, ooh, it's gooey, let's put my hand in it. So we kind of got, we knew that we had planned to spend a lot of time investigating the mysterious portal in Jean's office. And I expected some poor decision-making along the way, as my players are happy to do. Playing in character. However, I sort of misjudged whose dominant hands would be casually thrust into which dangerous places. So first off, Benji, Sol, and Tamsin spent a considerable amount of the time investigating the mysterious portal in the maintenance office with, honestly, admirable caution and scientific vigor. They got some sensory equipment that they cobbled together from Ganungagap, and they learned a bunch of information over the course of probably the next hour and a half. They confirmed, first off, that there's a certain harmony between or similarity between the power that Solomon has and the forces that emanate near the portal location. It's with the portal closed, it's just like a very low grade, magnitude 1 level potency. And when it opens, it's a lot worse. They also discovered that there are various copper pipes with bundles of cables that carry waste energy out of the office and disperse it into the building units via perforations in the pipes and cables. It's a little bit like a leach bed in a septic drain field, where basically you're taking something that is poisonous, hazardous, and you're spreading it out over a very large area, and so it doesn't cause as much damage, and it can be absorbed safely by the earth. And for the most part, the amount of energy that was leaking into any given big building unit was just minuscule and really harmless to the people living there, especially since the average tenancy of an apartment is only 3 years. And it takes basically at the pace that most of the units are set, would take at least a good 10 years before they might start suffering adverse effects of prolonged exposure to this energy. Before they wander off to another part of the city, and they carry that around like a dose of mercury for the rest of their lives. But it's not enough to be harmful to them. It's not something that can be passed on to anyone else. And so it was a good way for the God Machine to take that poison and get it out of the building without causing any unexpected divergences. Until recently, all of the building units were apartments. So there was a short tenancy, as I said, about 3 years. It takes about 10 years for it to even start becoming a problem, and 15 or 20 years for it to be a full divergence. So it was really rare for someone to diverge accidentally within there, with the exception of 4 units where they didn't do a very good job of, or there was damage done to those conduits to cause leaks that were more risky, which is how it came to the attention of Ganungagap in the first place. Now, Ganungagap actually likes divergences, and so they have spent a lot of time figuring out how to make more of them. And one of them is that they have transitioned over to selling condos instead of renting them. So there's some people who are still renters, but for the most part, they're aiming to market to people who are buying. The problem, of course, being that those people are probably going to diverge eventually, even if Gununga does nothing else to increase the dosage that comes out of those items. Now, they noticed that Steve's unit, which has always been a really mysterious place, the surveillance equipment doesn't work there. No one has survived more than a month in there up until when Steve started living there. Of course, he's like immune to everything. But it's missing some of the copper sheathing in his closet or behind his closet. So it's causing a much more dramatic amount of energy to leach out. In fact, even the rest of the cohort they discovered had absorbed some traces of this energy, but it was in the bedroom closet, so not a lot of even his cohort members are going in there and being exposed to that poison. The units that were occupied by Tamsin's soul, Abby, and William, who we met at the beginning, have significantly more perforations feeding into them, which is why it takes is enough to trigger a new divergence every two or three times a year. And it can speed up the process if the amount of energy, electricity that's coming in from the grid is higher. So one of the other things that Gununga has done to try to increase their output is to basically get more electricity to come into the building than it strictly speaking needs, and therefore increase the amount of energy that gets leached into the residents. The other 8 progenitor units, because there's another 8 of them, don't have more perforations, but what has happened is somebody has basically stuck the equivalent of gum in all the perforations down the line. And so because there's these perforations here closer to the source, and normally it wouldn't be a lot of energy coming out of here, but because all of these down the line have been plugged, it basically causes more pressure to come out and increase the amount that's coming out into these units. And so that's one of the ways that Gununga has increased the output of deviants from serendipitous gardens. One place that they discovered doesn't have any perforations was Karen's office. So that's a useful piece of information. So that was a lot of information. It's dumped very quickly to you. It took a little bit longer over the course of a session for the rest of the group. But that was not all that happened in episode 9. While the rest of the cohort was playing kid scientist in the condominium ductwork, Steve was following up on the leads he gathered about his own past. You'll recall that he had as long as he lived in Serendipitous Gardens, he's felt an inexplicable antipathy toward the minister of First Savior Church, which is the church just across the street. In an early episode, he discovered that he was being used as bait by a guardian of the veil named Guernica to catch a soul-eating sorceress named Alicia, whom he married and then betrayed, and then I guess they betrayed each other. And in the previous episode, he learned that the minister of First Savior's Church is also known as Guernica, and so putting those two together was kind of crucial in kind of determining his next steps. So with this information in hand, Steve decides that he is going to confront Guernica at First Savior Church, but he doesn't want to do it alone because in character he's not quite sure how that's going to go. He doesn't know. I mean, obviously this person was his boss at some point, so probably has some kind of power. But also from an out of character perspective, it's always fun to bring Noel along on things, so things can go horribly wrong. Although in this case, Noel was not to blame for what happened. The church itself is pretty unremarkable, and nothing too exciting. The receptionist has no problem directing him to Kevin Leake's office, Reverend Kevin Leake's office. It's not like they're carrying any weapons, and although Benji considered it briefly, they decided that would kind of provoke any kind of violent response that this sorcerer might have if he recognizes there's a threat there. Now Steve is pretty upfront. When he meets Kevin, and it says, I know you're Guernica, and I want some answers about what happened to me. And Guernica responds with equal directness, as we saw with his conversation with Tamsin. your soul is useless and no one would ever want to eat it. That fun conversation from a couple episodes ago. Most of what he says lines up just with Steve's previous research and with the conversation that he had with Alicia in the asylum. Guernica blames Steve's memory loss on a flawed transfer of Alicia's soul into him, a condition that ultimately forced him to retire because he couldn't remember his mission anymore. And he also explains that Lisa Fields, who was Steve's fifth wife, didn't exist, and that he was a fabrication to explain away Steve's sudden inheritance, which is meant as a sort of pension for the Guardians of the Veil for his years of service. However, this story doesn't fully explain what happened to Barbara and the rest of Steve's twins. As soon as he mentions Barbara and that mysterious death, where Steve was briefly considered the only suspect in their murder, Guernica's eyes move very slightly toward the cabinet behind Steve and Benji, and he reaches for a small trinket on his desk. And what happens next is not something Steve expects. It's as though another person seizes control of his body, causing him to pull open the cabinet, remove the assault rifle that was hidden there, and gun down Guernica at nearly point blank range. When Steve recovers control over himself, he looks in horror at what he's done and promptly drops the gun. And Benji is more than a little freaked out because with all the blood and gunfire and the receptionist right outside the office, there's no way that they're not going to get picked up by the cops. And the receptionist does, in fact, come into the room. But far from seeming horrified or panicked, she introduces herself as Agnes Nitt of the Guardians of the Veil and reassures them that they're not in any kind of trouble. Apparently, Guernica was on probation among local mages because of how he treated Steve. Here's a little bit more of Steve's story. Some of this might have been touched on in a previous episode, but a little bit more played out in this case. Steve's MO when he worked for the Guardians of the Veil was to have an artificial personality written over his own, just a happy-go-lucky guy whom wizards looking for victims would find absolutely irresistible. But in truth, Steve was a skilled killer. On his character sheet, he had a whole bunch of merits for firearms, and it doesn't really go with the comedian act thing so much. And his true personality would manifest at a key moment when the mage thought he had him in his power. After some evil wizards used mind-controlled police to attack Steve and Clarabelle being Steve's second wife, the Proxima, who was worked with him, and which resulted in the death of his wife and, of course, many innocent police officers who, they were just mind-controlled or tricked into being there. Steve began to get a little disillusioned with his life as a hitman for the Guardians of the Veil. This worsened when Guernica arrived too late to prevent Alicia from devouring his soul, and although her soul replaced his, the fit felt imperfect. As part of that, he found that he could bring out his happy-go-lucky Steve personality without Guernica's help now. That Steve didn't share any of the assassin's memories, neither those of all the deception and murder, nor of the life of pain and tragic loss that had really characterized Steve's life to then. So Steve Assassin Steve, if you will, began spending more and more time living as that persona, kind of just going in the back of Happy Steve's mind and just sort of watching a normal life unfold. Happy Steve loved making people laugh more than anything, which Assassin Steve found fascinating because Assassin Steve really was renowned for having no sense of humor among his peers. And he started doing stand-up comedy, casually at first, and then more professionally. Through comedy, he met Barbara Downey, who was an absolute brilliant comedian. His success came largely on the coattails of hers, as they found they worked really well together as a comedy team. And their chemistry actually carried on off screen, and they ended up getting married and having twin boys. Assassin Steve had continued to do work for Guernica, hiding his activities from Barbara as best he could. But soon after the twins were born, he just kind of said he was done being an assassin and told Guernica so. The sorcerer did not take this news well. It's not really clear what the stresses were, and Agnes did not go into this at all. But when begging and cajoling and threatening failed, Guernica resorted to outright mind control, compelling Assassin Steve to murder his own family. At this point, the other Guardians of the Veil intervened on Steve's behalf. they granted his request to retire, complete with the pension, a place to live, and no memory of murdering his family or even that he had one. Guernica was forbidden from making further contact with Steve or using magic to meddle in his life further, unless, of course, Steve comes to him first and offers to, do it again. Happy Steve would live out the rest of his life in comfort, ignorant of the string of tragedies that brought him there. Assassin Steve would live vicariously through Happy Steve, only seizing control when he deemed necessary, such as to prevent Guernica from ensorceling him again. Despite his generally easygoing nature, Steve found Agnes Nitt's revelations about his past more than a little bit, upsetting, which is understandable. Because really she was telling him is that his entire personality, the reason that he had amnesia and didn't remember his past was he had no past. He was a completely fabricated personality. He was an imaginary person put there in place by a mage to act as a decoy for a horrible cold-blooded murderer. This is the sort of existential crisis that Amnesia 5 should get you, I figure. In lieu of an end of the chapter vignette, I narrated a brief report from Agnes Nitt to her superiors. In it, she told them what happened to Guernica and that she regarded Steve's case as closed, with a plea not to allow any other wizards to study his peculiar memory loss issues as a mystery. She admitted that they still had not solved the mystery of what had happened to Marie Stadler, which was his first wife, but given that it had been 20 years, they probably never would. Okay, so episode 9, very heavy on exposition. A lot of stuff was explained. Not a lot of stuff that happened, but a lot of stuff that was explained. Well, I guess Guernica's death was pretty dramatic. That was the first conviction touchstone that they killed in the course of the game. Episode 10 was mostly spent taking all the information they learned in episode 9 and deciding what to do with it. Mostly spent that way. So Saul informed Francois, who's the AI in charge of data management, that they are researching this, that he and Benji are researching the strain energy in the building that causes divergences, and that they believe they can direct it in an intentional and controlled way. But they need some space in which to conduct their experiments within the building. Conspiracy quickly approves this and offers the resources to make this happen. And to some extent, the cohort does exactly what they promise. They claim room 301 for their experiments and begin construction of mysterious apparatus tied to the conduits. However, they also use their newfound requisition powers to acquire some extra materials needed for their research into the portal in Jean's office. First of these is a radiation-proof Faraday backpack, which will serve as a prototype suit for traveling through the portal, because they figured out how to make Steve's pancake mixer produce raccoons consistently, and they intend to use them as test subjects in his experiments, in their experiments rather. They also intend to shield a motorcycle with a carrier car against the portal's hostile environment, in case the tunnel turns out to be miles long. They hope that they can use what they learn about the portal to create a weapon that they can use against Jean if he comes out of the portal again, or if the other Jean, it's complicated, if Jean comes back. The true purpose of the apparatus, though, is to channel lethal doses of portal energy into room 301, a manufactured accident which they hope will kill key members of the conspiracies, read their touchstones or conviction touchstones. When the device is finished, the cohort announces that a demonstration of it will commence, and Tamsin uses her influence with the conspiracy to ensure that the people that they actually want to kill are there, Jared Cuckwalder Jr., and also the real Karen, not Abby in disguise, so that they can be there when the accident happens. So that's a big setup for next episode, where that plan goes very right and very wrong. Meanwhile, Gununga Gap intends to move Soul and Tamsin to different units, since there's no nothing the conspiracy gains by leaving them in the special units they currently occupy. They're not going to diverge twice. Now, the cohort has received, or these two members of the cohort have received assurances that their new condos won't have nearly as much surveillance as the current ones do. But Tamsin doesn't believe that. However, she knows she's really under tight surveillance, so she can't just tip off Gununga Gap by simply asking Benji to sweep her new unit for bugs. So she tries to hatch a clever roundabout plan. So she changes into a cat, and speaking as a cat to Bjorn, her manticore, she explains to him that she wants him to go to Steve, since his unit can't be surveilled, and tell him to ask Benji to check her new unit for bugs and get rid of them. Bugs meaning, of course, surveillance devices. Bjorn attempts to carry her message to Steve, and she does pretty well on the animal empathy check or animal ken check to at least get him to cooperate, which isn't always a good, easy thing with a cat. But the cat, being a cat, instead tells Steve that Tamsin is concerned that there might be an infection of bugs that Benji should get rid of for her, implying some sort of insect life form. Steve now has been in multiple conversations about the conspiracy's surveillance within their units. So he knows that they're under surveillance everywhere except his condo. However, he also has amnesia 5, and the way Jake has consistently played it is that sometimes he forgets more recent and important things, not just things that happened prior to divergence. So he takes Bjorn's message at face value, rather than interpreting it in its intended spirit. And he invites Benji to his unit and explains that Tamsin thinks that the reason Gununga Gap is giving her an apartment upgrade, or an apparent upgrade rather, is that the new unit has a cockroach infestation. Now, Benji is not a dumb guy. He suspects that there's some kind of message that's been garbled. Steve has done and gotten confused about things many times before. So he sort of suspects that there's more to it than that. But he goes and gets some bug bombs from the building supply, hoping that whatever Tamsin is really after will be obvious when he gets there. And then he also convinces Soul to come along and act as sort of a lookout and perhaps an extra set of hands if they become needed. Now, when Benji enters the unit, his hallucination scar kicks in, and he sees a room filled with cockroaches with human ears crawling on every surface of the room. He sets off the bug bombs, which fills the room with poisonous gas, and then runs screaming back into the hall without any explanation of what he saw. Now, Saul, just outside the room, is confused and decides to investigate. So he runs into the room, into the unit. Immediately, his eyes are watering as he's encountering this gas. So he activates Stormcaller to try to get some kind of a current to push the gas away from himself and neutralize it so that he can actually investigate what it is that freaked Benji out so much. But then he loses control of it because fluctuating variation. And it escalates really rapidly. And suddenly the condo is filled with crackling electricity that shorts out every appliance and just destroys it. And then, just to make a already pretty terrible situation worse, his involuntary bioluminescence triggers and floods, the entire unit with hard radiation and lethal doses of hard radiation. So in summary, Benji never got around to sweeping the new unit for cameras and microphones, although they all got fried when the electricity got out of control. And the incident ends up forcing Tamsin to escalate matters in order to avoid the move entirely, because she doesn't want to move to a unit that has no appliances, is just been bombed with poison gas, and also is full of lethal radiation. This was a really interesting scene and is kind of unique among all of the ones in the Chronicle, in that it really showcased how multiple scars triggering in rapid succession can turn something really routine, like, hey, could you sweep this room for bugs, into something that just is absolutely insurmountable. And it was just a really funny incident that ate up a lot of time, but it was a really good illustration of just how much a scar can ruin your day, especially when all your other friends have scar problems at the same time. Now, the other arc of this was while the rest of the cohort was focusing their attention on the conspiracy and their move and the upcoming move, Steve is now sort of struggling with his whole self-image. So if he was so right and yet so wrong about Guernica, could the comedian he hates so much for no discernible reason also have some tie to his history? So he goes to this comedy club where the said comic named Jeffrey Hurd is performing. Jeffrey seems like a harmless enough sort, and he's legit funny. And though his act is clearly inspired by Steve's, it isn't a ripoff. He's not taking muscling in on his bit. Now the comedian recognizes him in the audience and approaches him afterwards. It just like, oh my gosh, just like serious fan of Steve's, and just buys him a drink and like just totally geeking out about this and like kind of nosing in, asking for advice about how to make it in the biz. And because he's just a small time comedian, small time stand up at this time, and he wants to hit it bigger than this. Now Steve can't quite resist the urge to give his unwanted protege lots of bad advice in the process of this, because conviction touchstone. But he still has no better understanding of why he hates this band so much, and so he kind of walks out of the comedy club, kind of failed in his intended purpose. As he returns home, Steve has a feeling that he's being watched or followed, but he can't get a good look at who it might be. Soon after he reaches his unit, there's a knock on the door, and Jeffrey Hurd is on his doorstep, or just outside in the hall. And not only is it weird that he's there, but he asks Steve if he can crash there in rather urgent tones. And this is definitely crossing a line, even by fandomist standards. And Steve lets him know it. He's pretty blunt in this case. And then suddenly Jeffrey's face and body shifted. It's Gene that's standing outside his condo door. And he basically tells Steve that you need to let me inside so that we can talk privately where the machine can't eavesdrop. And that's where we ended episode 10, and we pick up again in episode 11. So I hope that makes the rest of the chronicle make a little bit more sense. And thanks for watching.